you are talking about right now. I mean, in the room of the panel discussion.
Okay. Well, I cannot see the room. I had hoped that we can do that, so also I can see Anna and Detmar, of course. Those should be there, so I will just speak into...
Oh, there we see it.
Perfect. And now I also can see us. Very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Very warm welcome here to this panel on threats to media freedom and the rule of law. I'm Donáth Kaddik. I'm the executive director of the European Liberal Forum here at the Alpha of the Freedom Games. As we have a special setting today, I think I look more like Big Brother than the usual facilitator than we have for a panel. But actually, I think that might be quite fitting for the topic that we have here today. I have the great privilege to welcome four distinguished speakers that I will introduce in just a second. But before we do that, I would like to go through a couple of housekeeping rules. There should be the option of raising questions here on Zoom if you follow it and on the channels. If you do, please raise your hand and ask questions in the chat so I can see them. So, media freedom and rule of law are indeed cornerstones of functioning democracies. With this, they should be universally applied also in the European Union. Unfortunately, both appear to be in decline, especially in younger union members. Polish, Hungarian, and Slovenian authorities have attempted to silence independent media. Bulgaria has been sliding down to place 112 in the Reporters Without Borders report, being eye to eye with Brazil or Indonesia. The scheme seems to be as simple as effective: seize control over institutions to silence or journalists, or seize media to solidify economic and political power. So the question today, does the EU have the means and the courage to deal with this clear breach of principles, or will those cracks widen further? In order to discuss this, I have the great Anna Donáth, member of European Parliament from Hungary, with me today, Detmar Doering, the resident representative, project director of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom for Central Europe, Baltic states, Michal Šimečka, the member of the European Parliament, vice president of the Renew Group, and James Harding, British journalist, former director of BBC News, and now affiliated with another entity, the Discovery Channel, also in Poland. I would like to do the very simple. I will give each of the participants 3 to 5 minutes for the take on things, and I hope then to get into a small discussion with all of you. I hope that is okay, and I really would like to start with Anna today, because Hungary seems to be a bit of the poster child of the aforementioned scheme. Do opposition and free media stand a chance given the resources and propaganda of the governing regime? Do European values actually have a chance?
Thank you so much. I have some issues with the mic. Thank you.
I will try with that.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for inviting me for this really important discussion, and welcome everybody. It's really great to see that hybrid conferences can work in the 21st century. I think it's COVID which taught us, but I think it's important to highlight that, for instance, this is a tool in order to create public sphere, because why media pluralism is really important to keep, to fight for it, and to reinstore, because it is fundamental when we talk about public sphere. This is something we are really dearly missing in Hungary. To just right away answering to your question. Of course, in the past 11 years, we could see how rule of law and media pluralism was dismantled in Hungary. I think for a long time, they made it in such a smart way, especially because our government were not confronting them much with the European Commission or within the Council, and they were a part of the EPP, which is the biggest political group in the European Union level. Therefore, nobody really cared what's happening in Hungary. And now it seems like it's too late. However, I have to say, it's never too late. I am a Hungarian, and I don't want to accept that it's too late, because we do have a future, way much more beyond this government think about having political power. What we can do, first of all, we have to do everything in order to create that public sphere that it's well missing nowadays in Hungary. Sometimes you don't have to think about anything new or complex solutions, just go back to old school. We have to start going back on the street and start creating conversation. I know it's tough, especially in COVID times, but this is the only way when we can, indeed, as a snowball effect, actually giving back something for the people and make them realize how much they actually need these public spheres. Because right now, in Hungary, we are living in parallel realities. We don't have a media landscape where everybody can get well informed. Basically, the majority of the private media became, in one hand, in a monolithic entity funded or paid by state advertisement. We don't have state media anymore because it turned to be a propagandistic tool of the government. And if you look around the media landscape, you see that 80% is within the same ownership hands. There are independent media in Hungary. The question is always about the outreach, how many people it can reach. Therefore, in Hungary, the last free sphere is social media, which is going to turn to the new questions of Europe about the Digital Services Act and Digital Market Act, but I'm not going to go that far. I just wanted to put a circle around that issues which is nothing important in one country can be lifesaver in the other. And if we don't have public sphere because the media landscape doesn't give us, we have to create by ourselves. And I believe that in the 21st century, Europe is not necessarily have to think on a national state level. We can think about the European level because European public sphere doesn't exist either.
Thank you so much, Anna. There would be so much to unpack for a whole seminar to talk about right now, especially about the concentration of media ownership and concentration of funding. And if I may just have a short follow-up question about that. Can you be a bit more specific on what that actually means for the freedom of media in Hungary, if not only the media ownership is concentrated, but also the funding only goes to media companies that are in line with what the powers that be actually deem acceptable?
It's really simple. Basically, there is no competition on the media market. When we are looking at newspaper, news sites, and radios, they doesn't exist because they are the best and because there are people interested in the content they are providing, but because they got lots of state funds. Therefore, those media outlets, which actually working from the market, they have to work twice as much for the same advertisement in order to survive. So those ones which are favored by the government doesn't have to do anything in order to get paid, comparing to those ones who actually want to do quality, independent, objective media work.
Thank you so much, Anna. Handing over to Detmar, and you have been observing the entire region of Central Europe and the Baltic states for a while. Are those trends that Anna mentioned, are they universal? Are there these Gallic villages that resist this temptation? And is there a vaccine that we can see against these trends in this region?
Very complex question, admittedly. A lot to be said. Of course, there are examples where things are better. I mean, Estonia, for instance, is by all standards functioning democracy with media freedom and there's little to complain about. What I say, I like the idea that we connected freedom of media with the rule of law. It depends very much whether you still have functioning institutions and functioning laws. The point with media freedom that we see only in more or less in some of the Central European states, primarily Hungary and Poland, is it's no direct, I mean, the old traditional media freedom was you wanted to have a constitution article that journalists are not arrested, murdered, or tanks attack the press building or something like this. But it's, well, some company buys a newspaper, new people are nominated to state media, and in all these instances, the problem is that the checks and balances have failed to work, and they have been undermined systematically by the support of an electoral system, sometimes like in Hungary, so that fairly absolute majorities could simply carry out these designs. It's not necessarily so, but I think there are some things that the EU could do, perhaps be more consistent in its approach, but there are also limits to it. I mean, at the end, it is something that in the countries has to be changed itself. If you want to restore media freedom, you have, although you are fighting an uphill battle, like Momentum does, admittedly, to win the election and to restore the rule of law, because the problem is too complex that simply the EU says, listen to this paragraph, I don't like this, you have to change this. You say that many of the governments can toy with this. I mean, they make a little bit modification and then wait what happens. And there are very few weapons in the store of the EU. At the end, there would be suspension, and this is something nobody could want. But what I do think is that in the long run, the democratic tendencies will work against this type of government. It's old-fashioned in many ways. It doesn't tackle the problems. The oligarchic system, I may consider it so, correct me if I'm wrong, in Hungary will impoverish people and create a feeling of injustice. And there are cracks in the wall, and they can be used. What is important is that the EU also stands by civil society that works against this. And that's why we are, for instance, at the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation, are here and collaborate with this fabulous event here to do exactly this. And there must be some economic pressure from the EU. It can be done, I'm quite certain. Also, we may be able, if one country gets on a better way, to break a little bit the V4 cartel, where they protect each other. That's also something. They have different objectives in mind. Hungary is pro-Putin, the government. Poland certainly not. Here you have a very much misogynic government. You have homophobe government in Hungary, but in Czech Republic, for instance, they are just on the way to be the first Central European country to legalize same-sex marriage, for instance. They have no common, but they are eager to block the EU. And I think each country that ceases to do this can be helpful. So we have to act one by one, and perhaps one should go with the easier candidates. Probably Slovakia, certainly Czech Republic, and we can perhaps isolate these regimes.
Thank you very much, Detmar. I think you opened just a can of worms that I would like to come back to in just a little bit. But you mentioned institutions already, and the guy to talk about institutions and rule of law in general is also here, not in the room, but surely in the call. Michal, can we have your take on the general rule of law situation? Because you were talking before about the bigger picture, and when we were talking privately, that we have to keep in mind.
Yes, thank you very much, Daniel, and it's great to be here, at least in this hybrid form, and it's a pleasure to be part of this panel. before I address your question, just to quickly come back to something Mr. Doering said about today the threat to media freedom not being that of journalists being persecuted or killed, and I just feel the need to say that being from Slovakia, that actually there was a journalist in Slovakia, Mr. Jan Kuciak, who was killed because of his investigative work. So even though I absolutely agree that the bigger problems for media freedom and pluralism are precisely lack of independent regulation and concentration of power and abuse of state resources, but there's nonetheless still in the EU even today there are journalists who are unable to do their work freely and free from fear. But going back to Daniel, your question, I think again, I mean, media freedom is just one part of what we're dealing with, and the larger picture and the one the European Union is sort of unable to address is made up of both an assault on media freedom, obviously the assault on rule of law and independence of the judiciary, as well as in civil society, as well as on fundamental rights. And the problem with the European Union is that it can only tackle, separately these pieces of the larger whole. I mean, obviously, it has launched, infringement proceedings in Article 7 and all that against, countries like Poland and Hungary for their rule of law transgressions. It has, the Commission in particular, has even stepped up in recent weeks. One might say that there's some positive development. They're withholding approval for Hungary and Poland for the recovery fund, as well as finally, hopefully, applying the rule of law conditionality. So over the past 2 years, we have more and more kind of tools, and the Commission is actually using them. But we're still addressing these separately. As there's a problem with the media, so we're going to have an anti-SLAPP legislation, which is good, definitely. There's a problem with the Hungarian government, adopting an anti-LGBTI and discriminatory legislation, so there's an outcry in the Council against that. We have the ECJ tackling the rule of law problem in Poland. What we fail to see, and what we don't have the instruments for, is the fact that this is all part of the same story and the same agenda, and that is, an assault on liberal democracy and on European values, be it driven by corruption or oligarchy or ideology, and those leaders or those parties that are taking part in this know very well that for one, they have to abuse the media, they have to take over the courts, and for ideological reasons, they have to go after minorities. The European Union, unfortunately, is not set up to have instruments that would address this systemic problem. And we, as Parliament, as the European Parliament, we have requested and called for such instruments which are holistic for a long time, including, for example, when we do monitoring of all 27 member states. What we've called for a long time is to not just focus on institutions and on checks and balances and rule of law, but also focus on the state of civil society, on the state of fundamental rights, and on media freedom, and all of these things combined because they're part of the same illiberal and anti-democratic agenda. And so far, you couldn't and hasn't come up with such a holistic approach. And just one final remark, which I would make is why it is important, is that because we might eventually be successful in beefing up our tools to fight discrimination of minorities or to strengthen media freedom and empower journalists and all of these things. But if we don't see this and address this as a systemic problem that is interconnected, I think it puts the entire European project in danger because none of our other policies, neither the single market nor security nor what have you, none of this is going to work if there are one or more member states which at some point become cease to become democracies. The EU cannot function as a group of different regime types because that would be the end of every common policy that we have, because based on our mutual trust, and that trust is based on adherence to European values. So that's just kind of the final thing. This is not just about media freedom, not just about some values in abstract, but it's about even the practical functioning of the EU going forward.
Thank you, Michal. If you just a small follow-up question, because I really like your answer about the holistic approach. But what are the instruments that especially the Renew Europe group is asking for in the European Parliament on the European level to tackle those systemic problems? How do we get out of this conundrum that you were just describing, that the EU cannot work as this mix of different regimes, can only work if we believe and work for the same values? So what are the concrete measures that we could implement?
Well, a good start would be a monitoring mechanism. We today have the rule of law report, and what we have been arguing is the monitoring mechanisms which looks at all these aspects, which looks at not just the rule of law, but also democracy and fundamental rights, which at the moment it doesn't. At the moment, for instance, when it comes to democracy or, say, the integrity of elections, the EU doesn't really have any powers. So we might have, a few years down the line, we might have a member state whose government kind of rigs the elections, and there's an illegitimate member of the council, but the EU cannot do anything. It's powerless when it comes to democracy. So first of all, it would be good if, whenever we're doing the monitoring, look at these things in context and look at all the aspects, all the pieces of the famous Article 2, right? All those values, including fundamental rights. And from that starting point, you can also think of measures to take that are holistic, that are based on that contextual analysis, be it when it comes to money or be it when it comes to other tools that Article 7, other tools that the EU has. But the start would be at least to see it in context, which with the monitoring mechanisms we now have, that's not the case.
Thank you very much. Just as a follow-up comment, there is very soon a rule of law mission that is going to Bulgaria, for instance, due to the massive problem. The delegation leader is ours, Sophie in Feld, who will look at the situation there. And I have to disagree with one thing. We already see vote buying on a large extent. We see bus voting to a large extent, especially in the periphery of the union, that indeed would need to be tackled. But let's go to the practitioner who just kindly cleaned his camera for all of us so we can see him a lot better. James, you as a practitioner, what is your take on that? Even though the United Kingdom is not part of the EU anymore, you have a vast experience, both on the island but also on the continent. What is your take on that? How shaky is the construct we believe to have built with democracy, rule of law, and media freedom? And have we been too ignorant about the threats that are out there?
Well, Donáth, thank you, and thank you for including me. I'm very worried. I'm really worried, and I should explain why. I should say at the beginning, what I now do is I used to run BBC News. I left just over a couple of years ago now to set up a slow news business called Tortoise. One of the things I also did was I joined a small group which is called the Discovery Journalism Advisory Group. So it's a bunch of different people in different areas. And we don't actually work on we're not employed by Discovery, but we get called in to say, okay, we're worrying about this issue on editorial independence or that. So obviously, we have some views on TVN. So I just wanted to say that up front. But I'll tell you why I'm really worried. When before I went to the BBC, I was the editor of The Times in London. And on my first week in the job, as you can imagine, I was incredibly nervous, thinking, I don't know how you edit a kind of great newspaper like this. And I went to go and see a former editor, really old school Englishman called William Rees-Mogg, proper, chalk striped suits, and we had a very formal lunch. And he said to me, the only thing you really need to worry about if you're running a newspaper like The Times is that you never get too close to the government. He said, if you look at the history of The Times in the 20th century, there was one editor, a man called Dawson, who in the 1930s got too close to the government, tried to be essentially a cheerleader for Neville Chamberlain. And it wasn't just that he then corrupted the coverage of Europe in the Times in the 1930s. He actually corrupted the reputation of the Times for a generation. And so I always come to this and I came to it when I joined the BBC, with a really simple view that I hope is principled, but more than anything, it's practical. If you want to have the trust of your audience or your readers, they have to know that you're independent. And what I worry about, and the reason I'm deeply worried, is that you're seeing two things. You're seeing, on the one hand, governments pressuring and in some ways suppressing independent voices in journalism. So those are getting marginalized, and they're using a whole bunch of different ways. They're making it more difficult to raise advertising. They're withdrawing their licenses. They're actually changing the terms of ownership. All of these things are intended to disrupt or prevent independent voices, particularly in Poland and Hungary, but not just there. I think the EU's got a problem around its periphery in some ways. You see this clearly in, member states like Malta too. But at the same time, there's parts of the, if you like, establishment media that then finds itself inevitably thinking it's got to get closer to the government. And the reason why I think it's really important to call it out is that it's not going to work, right? And it's not going to work in, I think, three important ways. One is, if you take Poland, the one that I've sort of observed most closely, is you pick a fight with someone like TVN, you try to disrupt and prevent them from doing what they're trying to do. And before you know it, you've got Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, a bipartisan group of US senators, all picking a fight with the Polish government, who should naturally be allies of the United States. And it seems to me to be a very big diplomatic price to pay. You deter foreign investment. Look at what's happened in other parts of the world where freedom of speech gets eroded. Foreign investment always dibs. So it's bad for the country. I think it's always damaging actually for the audience, because what happens is when there's lack of confidence in the independence of the media, what happens is all media suffers. Trust in all media suffers. And from the Polish government's point of view, you don't want to be in a position where there is not professional journalism that's trusted by the large majority of the public. Because what you get in those circumstances, as we have seen in many countries, is people lurching to social media where any old crazy nonsense turns out is referred to as journalism. And so, weirdly, even conservative governments who may find themselves frustrated by the leanings of, let's say, liberal journalists, in the end have the same shared interest in the independent strength of professional journalism and a free media. And so I do think this sits squarely as a problem, as I said, for countries like Poland and Hungary, and you do have to lay it at the door of their politicians and their governments. But we should also be really clear that the EU, which has, let's face it, a reputation for global leadership when it comes to competition policy on digital media, has not shown global leadership when it comes to the rights of journalists and the freedom of the media. So I think, a conversation like this, and I suppose the reason why we're all getting together on a Saturday lunchtime, is like, this really matters.
Thank you so much, Jamie. And indeed, it really matters. And you talking about social media and the dangers leads us full circle back to what Anna said in her intervention, that this is a tremendous chance in a country where we indeed have a problem with, let's call it the regular media, established media, that we have alternative fora where people can discuss and inform. But Anna, I understand that especially Momentum has been organizing very strongly via social media. But don't you also think there is a tremendous danger, especially if these vast resources come into play and basically emulate what you do, but with state money, state propaganda in their back?
Yes, I do. I'm just looking for the words what to answer to this question, because I think in many times, if I'm looking for rational answer, it wouldn't be something that you can digest, because actually the whole thing makes no sense. So don't start to look for rational answers. I mean, we are facing such a power which doesn't play by the rule book. So, I mean, we can start analyzing how we should respond and what we can do when the media landscape on in such a way when actually we can talk about there is a state propaganda machine built up in the past 11 years. And for sure, many of you have some idea, at least definition level, what is propaganda from history books. But I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying that if they said that today I was wearing a blue dress, half of Hungary not gonna believe me even if I'm showing a photo of today that I was wearing red. This is the power of propaganda right now in Hungary. So to answer to your question, what we can do is to not really bother the consequences or not really bother what they can do with us, especially because, as I said at the beginning, they're using tools that you can't imagine. We are not fighting with rational arguments. There are no debates. Right now, we are fighting against lies about our families to blackmail us emotionally in order to not want to fight against the system. This is what propaganda does. Keep repeating until people think that that's the truth because they heard from 4 or 5 different sources. So why would they believe just because I show them a photo? And again, this turns around everything we are thinking about social media as well, and fake news and disinformation. It's connected to that. Just imagine when at the state level, disinformation turns to be a propaganda with unlimited resources. And this is why, to turn back to rule of law issues and what the EU can do and how we ended up with the rule of law mechanism, because it's not just state money, it's not just taxpayers' money, it's European funds and European taxpayers' money as well. Why should Europe help autocrats to keep their power built upon European funds? But how Europe can somehow stop this process without punishing European citizens, in this case Hungarians and Polish people, because unfortunately the EU were not made up on a sense that we have any tools to only punish governments and not the people living under that government. But we have to highlight that the Hungarian government doesn't equal Hungary, and where we see the problem is not Hungary, but the Hungarian government.
Thank you, Anna. I would like to bring a question more to the general panel, because there has been talks about not only the independence of judiciary, it also has been, there were talks about systemic problems. And one of the systemic problems that can be observed is that Europe seems to be, or the EU seems to be less attractive. James was talking about deterrence of foreign investment. Unfortunately, we see foreign investments, especially from, let's say, unfriendly countries that have a certain different approach to rule of law, media freedom. Talking about Russia and China, especially, that have been pouring billions and billions, especially in countries of Central Europe. So whilst the European Union with its money is losing attractiveness, those countries come in, those regimes come in, actually building these rotten institutions. What do we do about that? Detmar, James, Michal, Anna, how do we work on that? James, the first taker.
Just, Daniel, I think it's a brilliant question, and it's a really important one to call out. 2 quick things. One is, I think these numbers are very misleading in the sense that you get very high levels of Russian, Chinese money into high capital, low employment industries. So large infrastructure projects, which don't necessarily supply long-term employment for the countries they invest in, but they do create strategic relationships. The second point is, if you step back and you don't look at ourselves so closely, instead of looking at, let's say, Poland and Hungary quite closely, and you look somewhere else, you look at what's happened in Hong Kong, the attacks on media freedom in Hong Kong have had already a really significant impact in the way in which foreign countries look at investing. There's a piece in the FT today which asks the question, is China uninvestable? And that is extraordinary. That's an extraordinary piece that wouldn't have been written any time in the last 25 years. And I think that that's the price of authoritarianism, is that people worry about the freedom, not just to move their capital backwards and forwards, but to assert their rights and the rule of law. And this is why I take the view that, look, I'm a journalist. Of course I believe in freedom of speech. Of course I believe in an independent and professional media. But even if you're taking a self-interested view of your own country, this is an incredibly self-defeating thing to do.
Michal.
Yes, thanks, Daniel. And there's been a growing kind of awareness in the EU on, of the malign influence of foreign interference. And we actually have a subcommittee in the European Parliament investigating just that. And that's, from social media all the way to, yes, I mean, infrastructure and financial deals. And you have the funding of extreme political parties is also part of the issue. In different countries, it of course works differently. In my country, I would say, for instance, that there is comparatively little Chinese influence, for example, on economics or politics. There is some Russian influence, but it's more through the planting of fake news and disseminating of fake news. But I understand it's an entirely different scale in Hungary. What my general point would be that of course, the European Union should be able to defend its institutions and its member states' democratic institutions against malign interference, be it in the form of corruption or takeover of strategic sectors or feeding disinformation. But when it comes to sort of our authoritarian politics in the European Union, I kind of feel hesitant to say that this is, dependent on or imported from Russia or China. It's not Hong Kong in a way. I mean, the Polish case is probably you know better than I do, but it's the Polish government and Polish all of the Polish governments have a very difficult relationship with Russia. So I don't see, but maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm missing something, but I don't see a Russian hand behind what's happening in Poland with the current government. So I'm just kind of worried that we might find that as a kind of an easy excuse that, of course we have an authoritarian problem and rule of law crisis in the EU because it's all kind of somehow masterminded by the Russians or by the Chinese and through their money. And I largely think that it reverses the case. It's a homegrown European problem, which the Russians and Chinese and whoever else is exploiting by finding inroads into those economies and into those political systems. So I would focus on this kind of domestic sources of that. What I find perhaps most worrying about is kind of the transnational influences of authoritarian and kind of far-right politics in Europe is how member states and these political currents influence each other. In Slovenia, you have some of the media owned by groups controlled by affiliates of the Orban. So you already have that kind of influence. I know it from my own country. And one of the worst bigotry and pieces of legislation from Hungary often find its way into the Slovak parliament because these movements and these governments copy each other and use the same phrases and the same framing and the same sort of outright anti-European illiberal narrative, which gets the press because of these governments cooperating with each other and buying from one another, or even actually helping one another financially or politically. I think this is not saying that the Russian-Chinese influence is not a problem, but I think we shouldn't use it as an excuse to see what the problem is back home.
Again, highlighting what you said, Michal, and it is complex. Outside interference is one thing, but also stressing something that Anna said in the very beginning, complete ignorance on side of the European institutions for a long time and active hiding issues through especially EPP when it comes to some of the most severe problems that we have seen in the past years. Detmar, looking at this entire conundrum, this entire set of problems, again, the question from the regional view, where do you see this cross-pollination of the authoritarians, and do you see a particular trend in the rise of authoritarian, let's say, clubbing? You mentioned the V4 already.
Yes, one must not overestimated. As I said already, the V4 somehow is a club where governments want to have some autonomy, what they think is autonomy against the EU, and do their own thing, but they want to do totally different things. Also, what we mentioned before, let's say Chinese influence is different in these countries. Russian influence is very much different. In some countries, it's strong on the media, by the way, because of the phenomenon that nobody trusts the official and the private media anymore, and Sputnik comes Russia Today as something new or so. That's why it may gain popularity. But it's different in the various countries. And one of the problems is that the EU is sometimes not aware of its own strength. There was a wave that the Chinese really tried via the president and some parties increase their influence in Czech Republic, for instance, dramatically, which was, I think, quite strictly fanned off because the government stood by. But in this discussion, it was suddenly very interesting. I remember that it was found out that the volume of investment of the Chinese is only a fraction of that, let's say, of Saxony, which is a bordering country, and it's not the richest state in Germany. The economic great power is still the EU that dominates the life, and there's sometimes not the awareness. And as to what to do, I only say perhaps start with the weakest of the regimes and get them one by one or so. It's, I suppose, even if the EPP, EPP is now more free because Orban has left, I don't think that the powers of the EU can ever be sufficient to provide for a real regime change, so to say, in the country. It can be supported. We can put more pressures, perhaps more consistent application of sanctions, have a more coherent, that was what I was trying to say, coherent approach to all of the rule of law problems, media, etc. Simply get a whole report on that to create awareness and to support somehow those who struggle against it. Again, I think the NGO sector is the key.
And as momentum came from the NGO sector, but especially because Anna is not only a member of the Legal Committee in the European Parliament, but also a member of the Special Committee on Foreign Interference in all democratic processes in the European Union, including disinformation. I hope, Inge, I cited that correctly. Anna, just the last big question to you. You were mentioning that there is a lack of, let's say, a European or in EU public sphere, really. How do we get out of that? How do we make ourselves more resilient in the process, especially with the experience and especially, unfortunately, also with the information that you have from the committees that you work on, but also in your, unfortunately, personal experience with those kinds of regimes?
Yes, first of all, you said it properly. I tend to choose committees which has the longest titles, therefore just call Liebe and Inge and everybody can understand or not. That's again another problem that we do a lot of really important committee work within the parliament with really, really important long titles, and then it doesn't reach the public. So when I'm talking about the lack of European public sphere, I'm talking about a sphere where people can read by the information, they can participate in these debates. And I'm not one to act like naively that, of course, right now this is the Conference on the Future of Europe with the same aim, and I don't think that every single European citizens will literally have a word in European decision-making. But this exercise is a really good example on, at least let's talk about why the European decision-making is failing and why we cannot talk yet about European public sphere. When I started to run on the European election, I never thought actually that I'm going to become an MEP. We are a movement, and we hoped to reach only the threshold, and then we reached 10%. However, I remember that we were keep talking about that. We just don't understand if there's so much word about European identity and European citizenship and that borderless Europe, how come that there are no mandatory news block about EU news in each member state's evening news? Why? Why we would ask so much to say that what Euronews is supposed to do is supposed to do in every state media? And then I started to look at the finances and all the support around Euronews, and it turned out that actually it's a private channel, and now they're cutting back on its funds. And I don't want to say something wrong, but I think from 1st of January, there's not going to be live streaming from Hungary, only online streaming. They are cutting the budget on the Hungarian Euronews in a country where we are really lacking of independent media. And all these circles going back and back and back and back. And I think we should literally rethink about everything we so far thought about how the EU works, how the decision-making works, and how we can democratize the process more. And it doesn't mean that everybody has the same word in it. It means everybody get informed and everybody can be reached. This is what the Conference on the Future of Europe should be about, and I really hope that we can keep as the leading force of it, Renew Europe, to take it in a path in order to reach out, because otherwise we can sit back and see how long EU institution can play the old school game, which is useless and powerless towards such regimes like the Orban regime.
Thank you so much, Anna. And if anybody ever wondered why Momentum made it to where they are right now, I hope now you know after this intervention. Just as the last question, because there is a sublime issue that came there in Anna's last intervention, and that would be, would it be sensible to create something like a European BBC, unlike a private entity, a semi-state private entity? 15 to 20 seconds, each of you, is it a good idea? And your first reaction, why it is and why it isn't. Maybe with a guy who worked for the BBC back in the day. James, good idea, bad idea, quickly, why?
Yes, it is possible. I think that it is possibly a good idea. I need more time to think about it. I think you'd rather ensure that there are the laws and protections of a true marketplace in information and ideas than necessarily a state-sanctioned or state-funded media organization. I'd put media freedom and media law on the priority list above that one.
Excellent. Thank you. Michal.
Yes, definitely a good idea in principle, and I think it's doable, and there were attempts to create something similar. But I think, I agree. It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to magically create a European public space. And it's technically and practically difficult to put together. But in principle, yes, of course. Let's do it.
Excellent. Detmar.
Well, I would be skeptical if it was just a monopolist station like this, because it would be a danger that this could be also one-sided on the other. There's somehow a tension between Central Europe and the EU, where some parts are legitimate. I would think perhaps, if so, rather the German example, that there is a kind of federation, that this is really, that we have really definitely have a pluralistic approach to it that reaches Europe everywhere.
And last, Anna.
I'm really optimistic that it's going to happen, and I hope I'm not going to offend anybody, but I think we need a generational mentality change in order to make it happen. As Michal said, it's not gonna formulate itself, I mean, the European public sphere. And of course, whenever we're talking about an EU-level solution where there's supposed to be a European leading or leadership, and every member state should accept, then we started thinking about, okay, but who's going to be the boss? Which member state going to send that boss? And then it's how it's not going to be objective towards the others. Indeed, because we still cannot think about being European and getting above of member state political logic. Would it be possible? I'm not sure. Should we try to raise next generations where in first hand they are Europeans and then secondly they have the nationality where they're coming from? Could be. Maybe it's an utopia, but I think this is a task we have to start figuring out, because we know from the past that it doesn't work if we are not start to build up a common European identity.
And what better place to think about these kind of things than here at the Freedom Games in Lodz. Thank you so much, Anna, Detmar, Michal, James, for your participation. Thank you all for coming, that are here present, that have been watching at home. And if we can take one thing away from this, is that we have a problem. It is a systemic problem that we have, but we need a holistic view on things to actually tackle those problems and some of the solutions we have discussed today. Thank you all so much. Have a lovely day and a great stay at the Freedom Games.
It's not always easy to recognize. It may look like this, or like this. It may be a burden, but it is a responsibility that we embrace nonetheless. But if it means this for one person and this for someone else, maybe it ultimately means being there for one another. It isn't handed to us, but we know where to find it. And how it feels, how it tastes, and what it sounds like when we finally have it. It means different things to different people, but for many, it means everything. And if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together.
Ausreise.
Now boarding flight 12:15.
You may now kiss the bride.
Work is different now. We're commuting less, virtually meeting more. Separating work life and life can feel challenging. It's easy to forget that to thrive at work, we need to take care of ourselves. Microsoft Viva Insights offers new experiences to balance productivity and well-being. Personal insights help you stay at your best and most productive. Add structure to your remote workday by opting for a virtual commute, carving out time to have a productive start in the morning and mindfully disconnect in the evening. Protect time before your calendar fills up for focused work, coaching, and learning. Take regular mental breaks with Headspace. tapping into dedicated moments of mindfulness. Use emotional check-ins to tune into your day-to-day mindset and well-being. Strengthen team bonds with stay-connected experiences that prompt you to praise collaborators, schedule one-on-ones, and follow up on pending commitments and outstanding tasks. Insights for managers and leaders offer windows into how work happens and the impact on employee well-being. Identify where teams may be isolated and take action to break down silos. Quickly discover opportunities to prevent burnout, promote coaching and development, and boost engagement. You and your team's well-being is important, especially in times of change. Taking care of one another allows you to thrive and your organization to build resilience. Experience how new well-being insights in Viva can help.
Liberté Talks to co ważne. Seria Liberté Talks realizowana jest dzięki wsparciu Google oraz Państwa darowizną. Na podcast z klimatem zaprasza Jakub Wiech.